The schooling system we know today was developed purely as an imported model from Prussia. And this is dangerous for many reasons, but how did this happen and why? Well, the why can be answered in a relatively straightforward way, that the Prussian model was not focused on educational content or learning itself, but rather on techniques of social engineering designed to remove the free will of the people, beginning with children. It was here to engineer. Horace Mann, who is known historically as the father of the common school movement and as the father of American public education, was the American government education reformer who was part of a movement to adopt the 8-year education model developed in Prussia. This German education influence also expanded throughout North America into higher education over time, which we'll get to later on in the series. In 1837, Horace Mann was tasked with examining different systems of education, and at the time he was considering the Prussian system. He was said to have considered it a great success for its government's purposes. He traveled there and lobbied for it back home upon his return. The traditional German, then called Prussian system, was adopted under him. Of course, the North American system, like Prussian, was designed for the purposes of government, not for the expansiveness of bringing enlightenment to all or to help society flourish. And of note, Mann's sister-in-law was even the founder of the first U.S. public kindergarten. Now, according to Mann and his study of education as brainwashing, this model could successfully remove the free will from a population within a single generation. The schooling system that had been developed in Prussia and imported into the US and Canada was entirely reliant on engineering as many forms of division as possible. Age-based separation, regimentation, predetermination of worth, non-spontaneous environments, top-down hierarchies, strict rules and requisite submissiveness, and, most importantly, the subjecting of dissent to ridicule and punishment. The point of all this division, subservience to the state. School became a preparation to feed the societal divisions of hierarchy and militarism and bureaucracy from the lower to the middle class, while maintaining their alienation from higher class education and access to free thought. By 1846, there was a law mandating education via the Prussian model for the state of Massachusetts, which then spread around the country. This system spread to New York City, then to the northern states, then to the conquered South. Moreover, the entire PhD system was imported directly from Prussia around this time as well. At that time, all of the promising students of the world that could afford to, those connected in some way to ruling class or money class, completed their education in Prussia. By the turn of the century, virtually every PhD holder in the United States was trained in Prussia. In fact, the first American to receive a PhD from Prussia was Edward Everett, who from 1836 to 1840 served as the governor of Massachusetts, the birthplace of the American public education system. He helped Mann spread the Prussian system. At the same time, Egerton Ryerson, the Canadian superintendent of schools, and Mann's contemporary, also traveled to Prussia and visited Mann to learn more about the schooling system there. George Brown of the Toronto Globe newspaper was quoted as saying, quote, "Ryerson had successfully imported Prussian education into Ontario." Ryerson went on to found residential school systems in Canada, something we'll touch on later in the series. This was based partly on the Hofwil School for the Poor in Switzerland. According to an editorial in the Toronto Globe of May 8, 1848, quote, Ryerson was introducing a Prussian despotism into Canada. Ryerson said that he desired nothing Prussian in the Canadian schools except the method of schoolroom instruction, and claimed that his new school bill was almost a literal transcript of that in force in the state of New York. Ryerson then set forth the chief advantage of the new bill, that it gave to the poor man the right to have his children, however numerous, educated, whereas the rate bill system compelled him in many cases to claim free schooling only on the ground of his poverty. The New School Act was to enable a poor man to educate his children and still maintain his self-respect. The school tax was to be levied not upon the children of the section, but upon the real property. The imported Prussian system was compulsory, which is unusual. It was also free. Certainly free education seems commendable, but to what end if also compulsory? Like military conscription? Well, what was the designated purpose for the creation of the Prussian system before it became an internationally exported schooling model? Well, the Prussian model came about after their military was defeated by Napoleon in 1807. It was decided that Prussian soldiers lost because they were too independently minded.
Every individual had to become convinced at the core of their being that the king was just, his decisions were always right, and the need for obedience paramount. In truth, the entire purpose of the system was to instill loyalty to the crown and to train young men for the military and bureaucracy. To do this, it was necessary to squeeze out all independent thinking from the masses.
In response, a new 8-year schooling system focusing strict teaching based on duty, discipline, respect for authority, and following orders was implemented. Skills for the coming industrial world were provided: reading, writing, and basic math. The predominance of obedience was stressed heavily. It was designed to instill loyalty to the crown and train working-class men to work in the military and bureaucracy, while the minority elite went on to further education. The working class did not receive secondary education. It was the Prussian court that primarily created this system. It was effectively a path to maintaining as large a lower working class as possible without them revolting against the upper class. Meanwhile, the crown-level elite gave enough to the upper class that they did not revolt against the crown. Importantly, the drive towards this form of social engineering and mind control can be traced back to the influence of Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Now, Fichte deeply influenced the Prussian model man became infatuated with and was seminal to the ideology that led to the development of our current schooling system. He is also well known to have been one of the ideological founders of Nazism in Germany. Not only was Fichte a driving force behind the German thought that led to school as enslavement, but he was a major inspiration for Horace Mann himself. In 1890, while the Prussian Germanization of American public education snaked its way through the country, European philosopher Charles Darwin, the namesake of social Darwinism and documented racist, proclaimed, quote, "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world." The architects of this system were Prussia's leading scholars, philosophers, and other students of the Enlightenment, otherwise revered as critical thinkers. Keep in mind that these critical thinkers were highly bigoted in their opinions of people of color, especially Africans. Among them, leading philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Now, Fichte was influenced by the likes of John Locke, a British philosopher, Oxford academic, and medical researcher. He was also heavily influenced by Genevan philosopher and Enlightenment influencer Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Both these men used scientific methods to define for the child what was learned, thought about, and for how long. It comes as no surprise, then, that Johann Fichte was influenced by John Locke, since Locke was well known for promoting the scientific fact that the human mind at birth is a blank slate. Similarly, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was an obvious fit for Ficke's extreme ideologies, since he promoted the theory that the slate of nature will degrade without law and morality as a justification for undermining the free will of others. And it was through the prism of law and morality that the mind of children and adults alike would be unknowingly indoctrinated into social engineering, which would soon sway the minds of the masses, without interruption, generation to generation. As was stated earlier, Ficke's philosophy influenced the rise of the Third Reich. He's considered a father of neo-Nazism. The Prussian education system was thus also effective in shaping the mentality that gave rise to Nazism. Because the public were trained to accept authority from an early age through indoctrination, nothing about this Prussian system was designed to educate people. It was designed for control over people. The education system leading up to World War II in Germany produced conformity, submission, acceptance, and subservience as a model. Of course, the children of wealthy families were educated differently in order to have and maintain a policy class and a subservient class. At the same time, the PhD system was contributing to the process of weeding out nonconformity and out-of-the-box free thinking through a version of science and logic limited by materialism. So many of the contributing factors that enabled the rise of Hitler came directly from the Prussian schooling model. This kind of social engineering is extremely effective because it means that questioning the authority or validity of anything was the fastest way to become outcast. As the divisions escalated throughout Germany, critical, independent free thinking was certainly not encouraged, or perhaps even allowed in the childhood education model, and this suppression led to expressions of counterculture bursting out in other places in the German subculture. Free thinkers, who were not part of or connected to the ruling class, were ridiculed and ostracized into subcultures. Parts of Germany, like Berlin, were wild at the turn of the century. Growing up in a repressed and strict environment, it was rebellious and corrupted, yet ripe for fascism and communism to do their thing. Art flourished, but it was a dangerous, drug-addled, promiscuous cauldron. Finally, at that point, the forces of anarchy, communism, and fascism brought this social experiment to a head with World War I and World War II. These are the sickly roots of every public school in North America today. Back in North America, much like the panic the German authorities were in over having lost a war to Napoleon, Horace Mann was fresh from America's Civil War, and along with his associate reformers, they were deeply motivated by the necessity of avoiding any kind of domestic uprising. For Mann and his associates, maintaining class separation and training obedient soldiers was crucial. They wanted a servile class and a separate path for the bureaucratic and policy class. This was important to combat the forms of conformity to keep the population from engaging in civil war while keeping able-bodied young men ready for foreign wars. Now, this was accomplished by promoting homogeneity and nationalism through repressive and subservient means. A political and policy class that did not think outside the box too much, but were allowed a little more education and freedom than the lower classes. And yet, they were still part of a system that self-regulated to maintain the status quo of America and Europe. Now, incrementally, over the century, the new versions of the old power structures of Europe were implemented in North America, and North America's native issue would soon be similarly addressed as the poorest had been addressed in Europe. Despite altruistic language and perhaps even good intentions by some, corruption and depravity were still running their course through these very unnatural systems.